Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. We're so glad you came back for this second week. Welcome to the second training on General Transit Fees Specifications, GTFS, as is more commonly known. My name's Nancy Doherty, and I'm with National RTAP. Marcy Jaffe, who you met last week, is our GTFS expert and will be our instructor for today's training. We're also joined by Carrie Kissel from NATO and Nellie Kubaharo with National RTAP, who will be doing some technical assistance in the background for us if we need some help. As a reminder, before we go on too fast, our final session is on June 3rd. Marcy will be available for those that have questions or, maybe some networking opportunities between all of you. At that session, we'll also go into a bit more detail about the demand response services and GTFS and some other advanced topics. We'll hit upon a few of those things today. But we'll take a deeper dive next week if you want to kind of really get into the more advanced features of GTFS, including getting demand response services up on trip planners like Google. But of course, as always, we'll start with a couple housekeeping slides. You do, as always, have a couple options for audio, including using your computer or using some of the numbers shown up on the screen. You will need to enter the ID if you call in. I suspect at this point everybody's good because we've all said hello to each other. So this is a training, and with so few of us, we encourage your participation. This is a hands-on learning experience. We'll monitor the chat box for any questions, but again, it's just a few of us, so feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. I'm sure Marcy wouldn't mind if that happened occasionally, maybe not every 2 minutes, but if you do have a question, we'd like to know. And as always, the meeting slides and the recording of the meeting will be posted at the National RTAP website, nationalrtap.org, in about a week from today. We're not going to be so heavy on slides today because this is a live demonstration. We expect you to work concurrently with us, but there are a few slides and we will post them. Okay, yep. So if you're lucky enough to have 2 monitors, that's great. But if you are like many people and have 1 monitor, we do suggest your screen be organized with the Zoom meeting on one side and one window and your work area on another, as shown on this slide. It'll just make it a little bit easier to have both showing up at the same time. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to, we went over some of this last week, but I do want to reiterate on the National RTAP support page. There's great resources, including the guidebook, which we sent you in the email. The link I'm going to put in the chat in just a minute when I get done talking and turn it over to Marcy. But in terms of the guidebook, you may want to download it occasionally, maybe every couple months if you're actively using it. I don't want to say it's a living document, but we will update as we get feedback from you. In the guidebook, we ask you to let us know if things can be clearer or need to be specified in a different way. In the guidebook, there's links, there's live links to 11 tutorials, which each tutorial goes into much more detail than what Marcy is going to go into today. We only have an hour. There's a lot of material to cover. And those links are also available to those tutorials on the support page, as I've shown in this slide. So just a little bit more about the guidebook. Think of it as a reference book. In other words, you probably don't want to read it cover to cover. It's 45 pages long. But there's a lot of great material in there. If you get stuck, you have a question, you might want to go to it. If you've printed it out for today's class, you may want to have it open as we begin to develop your files. And keep in mind, each tab corresponds to a chapter within the book. So for instance, Marcy's probably going to start with the agency tab in the import-export file. And there's the table, there's that page from the guidebook. Each table shows some sample data and it lines up with the columns in your spreadsheet tab. We've got the sample data. We tell you whether the information you're going to put into the spreadsheet is public facing. Like if you type in a URL in your spreadsheet, well, that's going to show up exactly as you type it in on the trip planner on Google Maps. Other things, if we say no, it means that it's supporting the data kind of in the background, but it won't actually show up the way you typed it in. Like a color code, the code isn't going to show up, the color is going to show up. We'll tell you whether the data point is required or not required. Anything that's required, you need to fill in that cell in the spreadsheet. And then we tell you the format that the data is in. Don't change the formats in the spreadsheets. That's really important, especially as we export into the text files. The text files are looking for a specific format. So that's important. Might not be a format you like for time or dates, but please don't change them. And then finally, in each table, you'll see some notes. We give you some reference materials, things that might be things you might want to keep track of. And then finally, in the guidebook, on the very last page, if you flip to the last page in the book, you'll find a checklist, which is really handy for keeping track of what's done and what's not done as you go through this process. It's a little to-do list, if you will, and it's really handy if you tend to jump from projects to projects and phone calls to phone calls and emails throughout the day. It's just a way of keeping track of the process. And at this point, I am going to turn it over to Marcy, our instructor. So as I mentioned before, please have your import-export sample, the sample one, that file open in your work area as we talk through the agenda. Okay, Marcy, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Nancy. Sometimes you're so thorough, I think, well, we're done. But there are quite a few details that unfold when someone is trying to read a schedule. And often we say riding the bus is easy, but because we want all of those details to no longer be footnotes, we're going to digitize them. And that's the process we're going to go through today. And you might say, oh, there's one more detail. There's probably a place for it. And so we may not be resolving every element in today's review, but know that it will be possible. So chat with us, raise a hand, unmute yourself and ask questions. So today's agenda is to really dive in, put your hands on these 2 Excel spreadsheets and to do some mapping with us. In the end, our 4th step will be to generate a fully valid GTFS file. We've asked you, and if you haven't had a chance, that's fine, but the intention is that there'll be a workspace on your PC that will be used for today's project and that you will have Google Earth loaded. And you need that Google Earth. We reference it because this is a mapping-based solution, and we need to have that Google Earth before the Excel macros will work. So if anyone has had difficulty attempting this, please mention it in the chat. We may not be able to discuss it together, but Nellie or Nancy will be able to help you, and I'll be there after the session if we need more than what they can do during the chat conversation. The Excel spreadsheets in your workspace should just be together. We're actually going to be using this feed folder to accumulate the data once you generate it. You don't want it spitting out everywhere and then you say, well, what happened? Where are these files that I need? So follow our process as best you can, and it should help you succeed. We're now going to have you follow along in your import-export workbook, and we're going to work on these 4 tabs. So for Rebecca, whose data we're going to be working with together, she doesn't have a spreadsheet to work with. She'll be talking with me about it, but everyone else, we're ready to jump in and have you see something that looks like this in the agency tab for the import-export workbook. And this is not saved the way I want. Okay, so Rebecca, when we want to put in your data for this particular agency, are you called Pecos Transit? I don't know if I'm saying it right. Is Rebecca on the call?
Transit.
Okay, and right now I don't have the URL for your agency, but your website would help people find information about your agency. And so each of you are filling in your URL for your agency in order to have a match between where your data is found. The next data element is related to our time zone. And in the time zone function, you have a choice of New York if you're East Coast. And so you would literally type in America, New York. And for Rebecca, we're going to use Denver. And that will be the time zone for Mid-America. We also have Chicago. And in your guidebook, there's a way to link to the wiki pages that explain how to get to the details that we need. And we can take from that list any corrections that we want in our time zone. The language is always going to be English, unless you're in another country. The phone number, again, you're typing in your phone number. This next tab is the fares. And if you have fare information or you're selling tickets online, you can now link it so that the rider can go right in and buy that ticket. The last is a public facing email for your agency in order to help someone understand how to gather a lost item and they need to email you. Our next tab.
Let's just say, is everybody all set on the agency
Thank you.
tab? Any questions or problems with that? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm assuming we're good to go.
We have a question from Natalie, who says, regarding language, New Mexico has 2 languages represented in their state constitution, although many more are represented. And so would you be able to link to both, Marcy?
You will have an agency time zone, and then within each of the bus stops, which are the geolocations that are going to be over a line or inside of a different line, you're able to identify the time zone for it's here.
No, I think she's talking about languages, Marcy. You know, when we put EN for English, can we also put in a code for a second language? Is that allowed?
I apologize. Time
That's
zone
okay.
was different.
Yep.
So language is going to be one language at this point. So
Yeah, but within Google, you can display, you can choose what language you want the information to be shown.
So that's correct. You could set your native language to whichever language you want, and then the user can, among 90 or so languages, convert to whatever language is native for them. Maybe more important than setting it on this back end. But what this is doing is setting the framework for whether it's going to be right or left language. So all of us working together, we will sort this out. So language is generally EN, and thank you for the question, Natalie. Our calendar function relates to what days of the week does this bus route or trip run. The service ID is the concept that we want you to understand. Often we have a weekday service, and I'm going to represent it Monday through Friday with those letters. You can do it any way that you want, as long as you're turning on and off the days of the week that are important. And then you set a start and end date, and the start date has to at least be in the past or recent. So you can always update this. And when we have service only on Saturdays, we're turning on Saturday service. If we have only service on Sundays, we would do the same process, possibly just fill down that data and turn Sunday on and Saturday off.
Yeah, zeros and ones.
Zeros and ones, very simple data.
Yeah, and these service IDs can be used by multiple routes. They're not linked to one route until you actually do the linkage in the route tab. So you may have multiple routes that use the
what service ID applies to, and then fill in the blank which data it applies. But if you're going to have future service and today's service, you might actually have a service that ends today or soon, and then a new service ID for weekday that will start that new service into the future. So there is an opportunity within your data set to not just let it expire and then begin again, to allow somebody to plan a trip into the future. And generally a 4 to 6 week window, a rider might be planning a future trip, and this would allow them to do it using service IDs that end and start.
Marcy, we have 2 questions.
Hold on, Nellie. We do have a question around the dates, and that is by choosing the end date. This is from Natalie as well. By choosing the end date as March 31st, 2022, does that require you to update it before this date next year, or does it go away?
All good questions. In theory, it should go away. What happens is, based on a slightly different calendar function, the feed has an end date that we will talk about in our feed info, and that will set the theoretical end date. Right now, what we're noticing is often the data stays on the map and an alert goes over that data saying, we're not really sure that this is accurate data. Well, then what does the user do? But this is a trigger inside of the feed info to say, warn me that I should be updating my data, and theoretically the date should close and the data should go away. And that is why there's a date, and you can set it however you want, closer or farther out into the future, generally about 2 years.
And I
is
think
there another question on service?
And I think Rebecca has a question as well. Rebecca, you can just speak your question. Oh, you're muted again. Let me unmute. Okay.
I think what I'm seeing is a question about what if I only have service on Mondays, or maybe it's Mondays and Wednesdays. We could now have a service ID that applies to anything and everything that runs on just that day of the week. I even have certain agencies that only run one Monday a month, and we turn on Monday and then turn off in our next tab any exceptions. So do we think we've answered questions about service IDs and how you can separate your data? Because what we're doing is representing an accurate view of this data in stop order by service ID, by days of the week. So generally a nod, or if a question needs to come back on service ID, because we're going to be working with it a little bit more in the schedule workbook. Our next tab relates to calendars, and I'm thrilled for questions, so please bring them on. When we have exceptions, and that means that our bus is not running for fill in the blank, a holiday, we can then tell that service ID to stop running, and we tell it to stop running with a number 2. Again, all of these codes are in your guidebook, but with some sample data, you might say, oh, if every federal holiday has a number 2, it probably means we're not adding service, we're taking it away. The adding service function comes in if on a particular day, let's say on Veterans Day, we have service, but we don't have our full service. We're going to turn off our full weekday service, and we're going to turn on a Saturday service. So there's a way to change out, make it functional, to represent your data. If you had another kind of service ID, like a holiday service different than a Sunday service, you would build that data and turn on and off with that service ID. So everyone kind of giving us a nod that service ID with our calendar dates allows you to represent holidays and any of those exceptions to the regular run on that bus every day of the week. You could have daily service and turn it on and off as well. Our next tab relates to, and we're going to replace some data here. We're going to create for Pecos Transit, and the way we know that we have an agency ID for this group is it's in our agency tab. So data is a bit of a database here in our Excel spreadsheets. And if you make a mismatch and you type it with a capital P, it's going to come back to you and say, I don't know who you're talking about. It really has to be an exact match. So all of you who like data will be thrilled that we can't make too many mistakes and have them go all the way through the process and create a glitch. There are validation tools in the system.
And sometimes, Marcy, it's just as easy to copy and paste, for instance, from the agency, grab the name and copy and paste. And then you don't have to worry about typing in an error.
Now, when you copy and paste from your website, sometimes tiny little gremlins come in, and you're going to need to drop that data into a text file so that we really just get the text and not all of the formatting. So those of you who've hit that glitch before will go, oh, that's right, don't do that. But do a lot of copy and paste. That's our goal. Some of this are systems that you're only going to need one time when you're setting up the route and the route details. A route color is not required. It is an option that makes it easier for the rider to see visually on the map. And so we have a tool in our toolkit. And so we're going to take a moment here and jump out of our Excel spreadsheet to the National RTAP page, where we've added some additional resources. We are calling them additional. They are resources available to you, including a color picker. And now you can go in and make sure that your color looks right. Another resource on that list is the calendar dates. We know those are not going to change. We know that the format needs to be year, month, day. So now we can roll forward with that. I am complete with the first couple of tabs that allow us in our data to move forward. Are there any questions before we start thinking about mapping? So those of you who've done this before, we're thrilled. Those of you who haven't yet, we want to talk about geocoding bus stops, giving you a chance to understand how to put your information on the map. Our first intention is to ask you, did any of you have a chance in the few little days and minutes since last week to contact another agency, a partner? You know, NATO and USDA are so good at making sure everyone talks and might find something that you didn't expect. Did anyone find any bus stop lists or information, and where did they find it? Can we open up the chat or the conversation a little bit? If these weren't the kinds of places that you were looking, was there anything additional that we could learn and maybe update our knowledge as well?
Not seeing anything in the chat, but Phil, if you actually were able to find geocoding for your bus stops and you want to let us know where you found that information, just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. But if not, we'll just it's just good to know that sometimes that information already exists.
And I don't fully know what asset management plans include, but if an asset is a shelter or a pole or a sign, you might have had to geocode to list those items. So, you know, again, think about it. Is there a chance there's data sitting somewhere, even if it isn't complete, it might get you partway there. So this opportunity, when someone does not have their bus stops on a list already geocoded, or maybe they need to review that list of bus stops. So we're going to show you how to create and work with the data that you have. There are two methods that we've suggested. These are at no cost. There are certainly hundreds of other tools out there. You can walk around with your cell phone and hit click. We have had some people try to drive inside the bus and say, I'm at the bus stop, click, I'm at the bus stop, click. And we suggest that you don't do that because you are now in the travel lane and you'll have to move that pin back out of the travel lane into a safer location on the side of the road. So here we will go through the My Maps method, method 1, and you'll be actually able to see how you would do the same thing within method 2 because they're related. We find in My Maps that sharing the map can be very helpful. So now we're going to beam in to Roswell, and we're very thankful that Becky can join us. Rebecca is here, and our data that we're going to work with is first to find a bus stop for Roswell at the airport. And so if I type in to get us close, and I want to go to the terminal building, thinking that might be a good start, I now have to ask Becky, where would this bus stop be located? Can you explain to me in words, am I near that terminal building? Am I one with the blue roof? And this is going to help everyone understand what it takes if I am not the person who knows the answer to gather a bus stop. So can you join us, Becky?
Can you hear me?
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So where this big green Enterprise Rent-A-Car is right there?
Yeah.
Enterprise Rent-A-Car is in our terminal building. So this is our terminal building. Right there on Jerry.
So now we want to move this pin because we don't want to tell someone to stand at Enterprise in the building. That's a little too vague. We want to be on the sidewalk, closer to where that passenger should be standing? Are they under this awning or walkway?
It's actually right there at the intersection of East Challenger and Jerry Smith Circle on the northwest corner. So
Okay,
Oh,
move up. You see East Challenger Street
Oh, now
going
I,
east
yep.
and west.
Yep.
And so move to the left of that intersection,
Okay.
and it's right in that area.
So I don't know if this is a little orbit or something cute there. So sometimes from the aerial photo,
You see how it looks like an airplane right there? That is
Yep.
it. Our
Okay.
shelter is shaped like an airplane.
fabulous. So again, I knew it would be exciting to go into Roswell. It will never be boring. And here we are putting our first bus stop on the map for the airport. And I'm going to delete the other bus stop that I thought was over at another building that just looked promising, and delete that by just clicking on it and hitting the delete key and renaming this one if I need to update the name. So I'm now building my bus stop list by taking charge of pointing to some place on the map, having someone as helpful as Becky say, no, 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 that other left. And we now have one bus stop. Now I'm going to go up to one that I, again, just guessed as best I could for Maine and Charleston. And just walk me through, am I anywhere near where you'd like that bus stop to be?
Well, I'm not exactly positive where that bus stop is. It's going to be in that general vicinity.
So let's just, we can just leave it
so-
at that, not to worry.
Okay.
Today's conversation is more, can I do this? And so Marcy put a few pins on the map, but let's say Becky informs me that no, it's really up here. So either I can move this because I put one on the map, or I just choose a pin, click, and now I've created a bus stop. It's as easy as that. You probably want to name it something so that you can remember when it comes into your data set, but you.
So all of our bus stops have numbers.
Okay.
So that list I sent you, it had a number, and then it also had the description. And so we would just probably put numbers.
Agreed that you definitely will have those numbers, and we'll talk about how those numbers can be displayed in a few minutes. And you did share with me that list. So at this moment, I wasn't gathering the number part, but we will have a way of representing for the public if they want to punch in that number. But often it is helpful for the words to be there in case that might be on their the writer's timetable. So here's a timetable where we would see airport, Maine and Charleston, Maine and Poe. And so we've now represented a few of the stops for this agency on the map by zooming out a little bit. More or less, it's a north-south route. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes. Yes, definitely.
Okay. There will likely be bus stops on the other side of the street. You don't want to represent the same stop going north. That's going to go south. And I absolutely want to be certain. We talk about the fact that this bus stop needs to be precise. It doesn't need to be to the nanosecond precise, but it needs to not put this pin along a white line or in the middle of the road. If you take this bus stop and start moving it here because it kind of sort of looks like it's on the road, that rider could get hit, and we do not want that ever. So you need to be mindful of where you're placing your bus stop. And part of the reason we're using My Maps and not Google Maps is Google Maps will sometimes put a pin there and then jump it some number of feet or meters, which may not be the direction you want it to go. This is stable, and that's why we're using it. So I'm going to close this experience where we're showing you how to use bus stop on My Maps. And for any of you who have a Google account that have opened up My Maps, would you like to try to put a few bus stops on and let us know how that goes? Or did you have a chance to try with any of the My Maps tools and ask us any questions? We think it's straightforward, but we've been doing it this
Yeah.
way for a while.
Marcy, while people are thinking about that, we do have a question from Natalie. She asks, could you use the Lat Long for map functions in one's phone on site, or do you recommend using a map?
Your phone would be precise as long as you're getting at least 6 decimals on either side, and it does need to be WGS 84. So
That's the
maybe do a
datum.
little testing where you are. Sometimes satellites are more precise than others in rural areas, and that's primarily who we're working with. And so we're making this available because weather and whatever, we want you to be able to update your bus stop with ease without having to travel. So
Right.
our
And-
functions have primarily been online.
Yeah.
Nancy, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I just want to say, if you're using a cell phone, if you can record the coordinates electronically, great. But if you're writing them down on a piece of paper, there's a lot of room for error there, especially when you're going out 7 decimal places for each coordinate. So in this way, you can do it right from your office, and you've got a great record if you're using Google Maps.
So Natalie, a great question. Anyone else? Because we do have, we'd like to be able to walk you through a lot of steps, and this is a very important one. I think we've reviewed details for stop locations, and for any of you who can now put a few pins on the map and have that list available, we can show you how to bring this list onto your Excel spreadsheet. So I think I'm ready to move forward unless there's another question.
Does anyone have any questions at this point? Have you tried it? Everybody's quiet. If we were in a classroom, we'd pick on a person, but we won't do that today.
This is Carrie, and I have a question actually. I was looking at some data for a transit system I'm working with that has routes that are somewhat imprecise. They go from certain communities to certain communities on certain days of the week. So they're a demand response service, but they do have route-ish services. And how do you choose a location for a bus stop when it's not an actual bus stop? Do you just pick a common place that you normally serve? Okay.
What we're noticing is that when they say we meet in blah town, they generally meet at the post office, the community center, the senior center. There is often a place where the driver will either start their trip and then do their loop for on-demand pickups, and people can aggregate there, maybe even park there. So yes, you can't just vaguely say this polygon or surface area will be our town. Call us if you want to get picked up anywhere in there. So for this process, because it's considered a static GTFS, we're going to build our on-demand routes with sample stops in those locations. So a perfect timing for a question, Carrie.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
Great. I'm going to choose the hospital.
Okay. Fantastic. That is a very common location. So let's say we wanted to add to our database and we are somewhere near a hospital here, not in Georgia. Is this the medical center? Might be. So again, these are monumental places, and very often I will see a pin just stuck in the middle of the surgery ward. And there is no way that I would know, I'd probably get sick trying to run around the building finding out the bus stop. So we do want you as the expert on your local data to come in with that pin and drop it where it needs to go, or away from that front door if that's where the emergency vehicles are. So we've got a good feel for how to do this, and
I believe that is at the corner. So if you go down and to the right.
Oh, the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's that easy. In a few words, you're explaining it to me, and I can zoom in or zoom out and make sure if there is a little shelter there that I'm safely at that shelter. So thank you for that. Some of you have used Google's Street View, and I want to just take one moment to remind you that often you can see a bus stop in real time. And here we are. We want to go to the UFO Research Center, and we'd like our Pegman to help us see exactly what is super cool there. I can sometimes even see the bus stop marked on this map when I zoom around and look around. So very thankfully, this is available in more communities. A few years ago, this was a pie in the sky. So thank you for letting me remember that. And we now will take our data with us and bring this group into our Excel spreadsheet. The way we do that is we go up to the menu for this navigation, which is here. I will say, if these green pins ever bother you, you just X them out and they will go away. With our 3-pin navigation, 3-dot navigation in the top right, we go to export. We choose the layer that we've created, our bus stop layer, and we choose export as KML, and we download it. A file drops into the bottom of our computer, and we ask that file to open up in Google Earth. There's quite a few blogs about how to get data out of my maps. You know, Google's offering one tool, they're not really offering you a geocoding tool with a back-end database. They will allow you to bring information in on the other side and capture it as geocoded from lat longs or addresses as best it can. But in this direction, we're downloading the dots that we've put on the map.
Marcy, I just want to jump in that this is why you have to have Google Maps Pro, excuse me, Google Earth Pro downloaded onto your desktop. If you don't, this won't work.
This whole
Seamless if
process
you
will
can
not work.
download it.
Thank you. So I'm not going to look at these pins again. I know where they came from. They look like they're floating in the universe. This is Roswell. Things can be a little weird, but not to worry. They're exactly where we want. We right click on bus stops and we choose copy. And the other way to get to that would be edit copy. And we now come into our import export workbook and we go to our stops tab. Now I had dropped some in earlier just as a chance to practice, but anytime we have a blank row in our stops tab of the import export workbook, we double click and we type in a number 4. If that's not selected, we say okay. And now we've dropped in all of the stops that we need and move the name. Now, earlier in the conversation, we were thankful to hear that these bus stops had some stop IDs or numbers associated with them. So this same data that you see, we moved the airport terminal a little bit because I didn't have accurate information, but we now have a list of bus stops for this group. And I was uncertain on one and I was going to talk to Becky on that. So we have a list of bus stops and we don't need 2 sets of lists. And this was a chance for me to show you Street View. In this spreadsheet, we have an internal code, which is what you will be using for your data set. No one else will see that. It's used to identify this bus stop. If you do have a code that the rider is going to type into their phone, often a 3 or 5-digit number, you're going to put that in the stop code. It's not required, but it would allow that connection between this stop location and a way to find out if the bus is running early or late. So that's what a stop code does. We also have our latitude, longitude. It has to be at least 6 digits of precision. A zone ID is used for fares. And so you'll use that in the event that you want to build a one-way adult fare and distance matters, or where that bus stop is in relation to others. And the last one that's important that we're filling in on this spreadsheet is whether there's a wheelchair accessible stop at that location. So if it is not accessible, or it's just not known, or there's some street furniture there, and you'd really rather have the rider go to a different stop nearby because it's going to be more challenging, you can be silent on it. I know that almost all of these are federally funded, and so likely they are all wheelchair accessible. Any questions about taking bus stops that were in my maps and bringing them into our Excel spreadsheets.
Marcy, just the location type, parent station, stop time zone, are those fields that people would typically use, or are they more for other types of agencies?
So think of Grand Central Station or your main Amtrak somewhere with 6 or 8 tracks, and you'd like someone to know exactly where inside of a bigger station would they stand. You can be more precise. Highly unlikely we need that in our rural area. If you had lat longs for all of your data, absolutely. That's why the beginning of this conversation was, if someone can hand you a list of lat longs, great. You can take this list and double click on it and export it and bring it into the map function and view it on your map. You can also, if that would be on a Google Earth map. If you wanted to view this data inside of My Maps, you could just copy and paste it into a table and view it there. We have found at times someone hands us a list, it really isn't as accurate as we'd like. And so you will want to view it before you trust that that data is precise.
View it on a map. If you get the data from a different source, double check it on a map just to be sure the stops are where you want them to be.
And our videos walk you through these processes. So, you know, today we're just giving you that high level. We're walking through a few weeds, and then you'll have a chance to dive in a bit more. Our next step is for you to understand how our schedule information works. And our schedule information is in the schedule generator file. And the schedule generator file has groups and trips. And the concept here is that each group or trip group or pattern will have its own ability to stay together. A blank row will break out a trip group from another trip group, and each trip group has a service ID associated, what day of the week, and whether there's a pattern change. So in the morning, you might have commute routes. In the middle of the day, you might go to the senior center, but in the evening, you don't go to the senior center. So that trip group of morning and afternoon can be held together. The midday is a different trip group. And then Saturday could be a version of the weekday or its own trip group with its own stops. What we're representing is, where does this bus go? There's no footnote in there to say this cell is empty, we don't go there. You can't do that with this kind of data. You're stringing together the entire day for one route and its trips and trip variations. So this is a concept that we've had some difficulty with. We're going to walk through 2 variations in terms of times for Roswell, and there'll be a day where you'll go, oh, of course, I can't just put no data into this cell. It will stop the trip, and anything south of that, below it, will not show.
So we're doing one route here, but 2 variations or 2 patterns, 2 trip groups.
And in this case, the actual stops along the way haven't changed. Again, we're looking at a piece of paper electronically that allow us to see a schedule. And on this schedule, starting at 6:27 in the morning, they leave the terminal, and that's what we have, a plaza or terminal departure at 6:27, and then arrival time at 6:38. So we're representing this data. Ideally, you already have it in Excel. You might have to use a pivot or a copy paste of this file so that you can begin to create it in this order. That's all we need you to do. You don't have to type in hundreds of rows of data. But there is something else that's really quite nifty about Excel. And that is that you can add time to maybe the first column that you fill in or type in if you have it. And in this case, the next trip of the day is 26 minutes after the first one. And what we literally do is equals the cell, and I'll type it in here, and we say equals the cell to my left plus time, and the time is set to whatever. It could be 0, 30, 30, 0. And I could now build a half-hourly service in a few moments and then fill that down for the rest of the day. And in this particular group of data, when I was working with it yesterday, I found that it didn't have an every 30-minute kind of feel. It was a 27-minute, then a 31, and then a 23, based on the driver schedule and what the riders need. So you're going to represent this data, bring it in from your Excel spreadsheets, no need to type it in. Does everyone begin to feel comfortable with this part of the data? And then we're going to walk through just how you get to represent the schedule with the stops and stop order. You'll enter it as a chat. And we're going to say that this route, which is route 1, what color is it? What URL does it have? We're referencing the data that we had in the other Excel spreadsheet. What days of the week does this particular trip group run? Direction ID is used often for sorting the data. So you have an inbound and outbound. So you will fill it in as 0 and 1 for a route that does have 2 halves. If it's 2 separate routes going 2 different directions, there'll still be zeros for that. A trip head sign, we're going to the mall, that's fine. In our data set, we will have a stop ID, and that's really what is being referenced. That latitude, longitude is matched to the stop ID that we had in our stops tab of the import-export workbook. And the names of the stops are going to match exactly what you have on your timetable. Airport, Maine and Charleston. And we want to be sure we have the same typos, because there's going to be a quality review and someone is going to look line by line, stop by stop, and make sure that your data is accurate. And this is going to give you a chance to do the same thing.
In other words, it absolutely has to match what's on your website.
Or you decide to update your website and then have that typo go away. But yes, you're matching between the two, and this is why it's going to be quality data. The next data element actually just says, tell me the next stop along the way. And we know that that's not literally the stop head sign, so people can get confused about that. But the convention now is, tell me what direction the bus is going, what's the next stop, and we just use equals the cell below, and we fill that down, and that tells us where the next stop is, and the last stop doesn't have a next stop. We have some opportunities here to say the rider must call for a pickup. We'll talk more about that on June 3rd. Continuous pickup, where the on-demand routes can say between here and here, anybody can get picked up at a safe location, just flag us down. We have a time stop, wait time, time points as a way of saying that these are actual times along the way. If in fact we had another stop in our database and we didn't know the time for it, we would merely fill in an asterisk in our database and say, hold that time in this trip, and the trip planner will calculate between this one and this one the distance and give it a stop time that's accurate for that location. So in this case, I'll just, I need to have something in the row, otherwise it will glitch up, and you'll just see how this works.
Hey, Marcy, you absolutely can't have an asterisk at the beginning or the end of the trip. Is that correct?
Good reminder, a trip has to have a start time and an end time. It can't just be a floating start time. It needs, the trip needs to begin at some time sensitive, at some time known, as best you can make that guess. Even if it's not on your schedule, you're going to put a time in there for the start and the end of the trip. We're now going to generate the 2 important functions that come out of schedule V3 in our schedule generator file, and that's where we go to the intro and controls tab, and we're going to be filling in the stop times and trips. And the way we do that is by clearing our data. We're not clearing all the data that we just worked on, we're just clearing the data for the stop times and trips, and then we generate stop times and trips, and these are the macros and why you need to be able to use macros in your PC at your office. And now we have taken all of your data and represented it in one long line. That's all we need to do in terms of gathering the data for this element. The trips are the same. And, oh, I forgot to fill in something. Something doesn't look quite right. I might go back into schedules and say, oh, that really is a wheelchair accessible data element. And I would put a 1 in there and solve that problem and just go back to intro controls, clear all, generate the stop times and trips. And now in my trips tab, everything is filled in. We just want you to see how quickly and easy it is to have a little hiccup and correct something. Our goal also is to allow you to create a timetable if you need to, and this is optional. You might decide, I need to refresh my website. If you don't have a website and need one, National RTAP can help you with Website Builder. And now I've created your timetable from the data that we've entered in just a few clicks.
And then you can format that in any way you prefer. But the data at least is accurate. In the
Correct.
table.
So now our next step is to take our stop times. And so we're going to go to the left of A and above 1 and copy and drop that into our import export workbook. And we're going to go to the same color tabs and drop in the 2 files that we need from the schedules workbook. What we've often found is that someone in the agency really likes to do the schedules. They're the dispatcher, they're a geek in some way about schedules, and then someone else can come along and help with the import export. We now have all the data that we need for our import export workbook, except one little data element that it's kind of our metadata. And the reason we want this metadata is so that we can know that this snapshot of data is the one that's being published. So we come into our
so this is in the feed info tab. Yeah, this is the last tab we need to work on.
For required tabs, and we make sure that the feed version allows us to say, yes, this is the version that we'd like to see. Now, we do not want National RTAP's website there, so it'll be Hicks at, and we have a chance here to make sure that you see what data looks like, but please don't have us with your data.
So this isn't anything that's going to show up on the trip planner, but if someone at Google needs to contact you about your data, this is who they're going to contact.
Correct. Our feed info is the metadata and a chance for someone to reach out to you as the data manager. Does anyone have any questions? We have now done all of our required tabs, which is our goal for today. And I would like to spend the next few minutes just taking this data and walking it through a validator. So any questions to hear?
Nothing in the chat.
Nothing in the chat. So we're now going to take this data and go to our notes tab of the import export workbook and generate a GTFS file. Now, the first time you do this, if you don't have a feed folder, it will say, are you sure? Where do you want to put it? We have a feed folder that we can make for you, and you'll say yes to that. And all of those other windows that just came through said, hey, if you had old data, it's going away. It's going to be the new data. And you're going to say thanks, because I really only want new data available. So I'm inside of my desktop, and I have my trip plan data formatted, as we said, for my workspace. And what we just dropped in a moment ago includes all of the files. If you need, because you want to be assured it looks like what it should, an agency tab is now a text file, which is what the specification requires. And the first row were all of the tops of our Excel file tabs and the data that we just entered. So looking good, we have what we need. Now we're going to select all of these files, and we're going to right click and compress them, because a compressed file is much easier than a bunch of files just floating around. And we're going to take a quick stop at our National RTAP page, because we have a feed validator. And the feed validator allows you to choose a file from your workspace, and in your feed folder, bring in the feed for a chance for us to identify, does this data look good? Is it making logical sense? So we have some invalid values. Maybe I left some old data in from another set of data. That's what came up. There was no stop ID that would match up to this transfers file. So they warn us about that. Oh, I had some old fares data in there. Anything that comes through as an error, we want to be certain you know there's something different between errors and warnings. And now the warnings give you a chance to say, gee, one of these shapes isn't being used, or there's some too fast travel. You're trying to go 190 kilometers an hour. Please check your data and be certain that the data makes sense to the schedule that you have. This is our set of review and validator tools. There are some unrecognized columns in here. You don't have to worry about those. They're in the warnings section. And what happens is we get some new features that get added to the toolkit that are acceptable, but they haven't been added to the validator. All right. Someone is checking email. Okay, I'm not sure there. All right, I have given you a chance to see what the file looks like inside of this feed folder. I've given you a chance to see what happens when we validate the data. The last steps that happen with your data in our process include us taking you to resolve our errors and warnings, and you would consider hosting your file at your website once it's validated, accurate, ready for prime time to share with the world, and you would create a stable URL. What does a stable URL mean? It means that you're changing the data on the back end, but the website that someone is going to is not changing, because Apple and Bing and Yahoo and everyone else want a chance to come and get the accurate data, but they don't want to have to retype in your URL every time. We have a chance at National RTAP to host your website as well. And so for any of you who are interested, we can review that with you. It's on the video. It's not a requirement, but there were some agencies that said, we don't want anybody pinging and coming into our URL and our website. So National RTAP can solve that for you. There are a variety of feed registries, including the National Transit Map, and they will require that you have a stable URL. And the way that you would have a stable URL is to always name that file the same file. And when you export that text file, you might consider calling it Google_transit or my text, my GTFS. As long as it's a stable URL and doesn't stable file name, you won't be changing the URL. We're really hoping that you will publish your data to the world. It really extends the value of your investment of time and energy. Many of these apps are free, and the goal of being able to make your data easily available to downloaded tools where somebody doesn't have cell service, all of that starts to happen because the apps consume this data and then make it available to you locally. I think we have topics for next time on June 3rd. It will be our demand response, how to create shapes, and an opportunity to work together and answer questions. I know we came right to the end of the hour. There was quite a lot that we wanted to cover with you, so you've all been very patient. And Becky, what I didn't do quite right, I appreciate that we're going to get to this, but maybe any of you could give us a nod or in the chat that you might think you're going to pursue GTFS or have questions that are holding you back from that opportunity, or Carrie could inspire us because we need wealth building through GTFS.
Yep, building skills, building access. Very much so, yep.
Did we meet your expectations? Could anyone give us a green light? Gee, it got more complicated, but then it got easier once I started to see it come together. Any feedback or concerns? I know we'll have a survey at some point to gather your deep dive, but to share with each other.
Marcy, I'd taken a look at the guidebook and I took a look at the data myself in the Excel spreadsheets. Watching you and how easy it was for you to just put it in really made it more clear for me. So thank you for that.
We all learn in different ways. So I'm thrilled that Nancy really spearheaded the guidebook because You know, there are times you just need one answer on one page, but we do have some videos, and some people learn by watching this and maybe watching it more than once.
We have a comment from Malcolm Meyer about how Google is close to validating his feed, but they're very picky on the colors. So I'm sure he appreciates you showing the color picker and checker.
This color picker thing has really slowed us down in some cases. And Malcolm, if you do need some additional help, we'll walk you through another back end that doesn't come up very often, but, or if it does, we can help you. We don't want that to be a reason to not move forward. But as Malcolm is saying, we want an exact match. We want the rider to have the best rider experience. So if the website says X, your GTFS says X. That's all we're asking. And it is possible to do that. But
I just want to make a plug for Marcy that she provides amazing personal technical assistance. So if you get started, you have problems, reach out to us, reach out to National RTAP, and we will connect you with Marcy, and she'll get you through this, I promise. She's done it for hundreds of agencies with us already.
there will be a moment you'll have this aha and it'll all come together. It seems a little bit foreign because you haven't done it before. And it's not quite like riding a bike because you won't remember all the details, but that's why you have the guidebook. You'll just be able to flip through and come back to it. And thank you, Nellie. Nellie is new to using a GTFS concept, and she took a few minutes, more than a few, to go through, and it does start to gel. So that's our hope. And thank you all for making yourself available today, and ideally on June 3rd, where we can do a little more deep dive and slow it down a little bit and review.
I believe June 3rd, you'll be going over on-demand services as well, Marcy. And then I'm sure if people do have specific questions, she'd be happy to stay on a little bit longer. Just let us know in the chat so that we don't hang up.
You mean today? Yeah, we can stay on a few minutes
We
if
can stay on if
anyone
like.
has questions. Yeah.
The spoiler alert is that for us to create an on-demand service, it's a bit of what Carrie asked about. Gee, they leave from somewhere near or in the town of, we create a snapshot of a route, a stand-in trip saying, well, here are some places we go. And then the rider calls in and schedules their trip based on the hint that you travel between these two towns or along these routes within or roads within a community. So
we get that phone number. We get that phone number to publish on the trip planner, and that's key. You need to call in.
We'll walk through all of that.
Yeah.
So Audrey, I know we had started some data for you, Audrey, with Hobbs Express a while back, and I think I sent you what we had at that point in time. It could be a year or so ago. If you want to unmute beyond the thank you, is there anything in New Mexico from your Hobbs world that you can share with us? Any concerns or questions?
We did unmute you, Audrey. That's okay.
And you may not have had a chance to go through the files, but honestly, people's positions change. They move on to new jobs, and Marcy might actually have a copy of your data from 2 or 5 years ago when you started your GTFS. Reach out to me. I've been surprised how often I've been able to dig in and get you back going on track, because that's all we do. We want to help you with this as best we can. Well, thank you all for attending. I don't want to end early, but I also know I respect your time, and you've graciously given us last week and this week. And now you get a chance to do some homework, dig in a little deeper, maybe work on any one piece of this and feel a success checking off your checklist. Okay, routes have changed. So Audrey's able to look at what she has and update it. Fantastic.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your time, and we hope this was really useful and helpful to you.
Yeah, thank
All
you
right, we'll
both
see
so
you
much.
next week. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Marcy.
Take care.